Hi, David here, and welcome back to the channel where we're looking at the teaching of divine love through the automatic writings of the early 20th century medium, James Padgett. In last Sunday's video, 10.10, we looked at a message from Lazarus, the New Testament figure who was not, in fact, raised from the dead. But as we saw, the New Testament story as we have it does recall a real incident. We've also seen one or two other messages starting to correct some of the things that are said in the New Testament Gospels and letters. Today, we're going to take a look at a message to James Padgett from the Apostle John, who is remembered as the author of the fourth Gospel, as it is often called. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are usually placed first in the New Testament in that order, and they are often referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because they offer a general summary of what Jesus did and taught, and often contain the same material as each other. John's Gospel tends to be regarded as a bit different from the other three because it does have different content and seems to focus more on the relationship between Jesus and God. Many people regard it as a more mystical book than the others, and like a lot of mystical writings, it includes passages that are difficult to make sense of. So in today's message, John takes the opportunity to explain and correct one or two things that appear in the version of his gospel that was included in the New Testament. The message was given to James Padgett on August 15, 1915. John writes as follows: I am here, St. John. Well, there are some things in my gospel that do not seem to be very plain, and perhaps are contradictory, because many of these writings were not mine, or written at my dictation. In the mutations of time, many things have been added to or subtracted from what I wrote, and as a consequence, the true and the untrue are mixed. It will be a very difficult task for you to make the distinction in simply reading or even studying the Bible, for the tenor of the writing is the same. The only way that you can separate the true from that which is not is to wait until Jesus gives you his messages. Of course, we can help also in that particular. So John is quite clear that there is a lot in the gospel that bears his name that is unreliable, to the extent that he discourages James Padgett from trying to tell true from untrue. Instead, the advice he gives James is simply to see what comes forward in the messages he is given by Jesus and the others, as well as John himself. The mention by John of things being written at his dictation is an interesting glimpse into how the Gospels were first created. We are told that many of Jesus' followers were simple men, so it is entirely possible that not all of them could write. At this point, James Padgett seems to have asked a question of John. Quite often we see that James has paused, looked over what he has written by way of automatic writing, and responded with a question to his spirit communicator. We don't have James's questions, as he simply asked them verbally in the moment instead of writing. But here he seems to have asked a question as to whether Jesus' death was in some way required by God or foretold by Jesus himself, which is a traditional Christian teaching. John replies, well, that was not the word which he used, because he never taught that it was ordained by God that Judas should betray him. In fact, the death of Jesus was never a part of that which God considered as necessary to the performance of his mission. Of course, it was certain that Jesus would die. However, the manner of his death was not foreordained, as my gospel written in your Bible declares, John 18:32. That's a fascinating paragraph that flatly contradicts a lot of traditional church teaching. In the aftermath of Jesus' execution, many of his followers could not understand how his death had been allowed to happen. So with some of them, the idea took hold that Jesus' death was somehow part of God's plan. There's lots of interesting and complicated theology that tries to follow through the implications of that idea. So at the same time as doing something planned for or preordained, and which therefore had to happen, Judas is also a traitor who did something incredibly bad that he has been reviled for down the centuries. Well, you can't have it both ways, as the old saying goes. John is quite clear that what Judas did was unexpected by Jesus and the others, was not part of any plan, and was not foretold. So what was going on with Judas? Was he the villain that many people have accused him of being? Did he do it for 30 pieces of silver? And John continues, Judas was not a bad man, as he was depicted to be, and his betrayal, as it is called, of the master, was not for the purpose of gratifying any avarice that he is supposed to have had, or because of any jealousy or desire to revenge a wrong. It was because he was impulsive and had a belief in Jesus' powers and ability to overcome the Jewish leaders in their fight to defeat the objects of his mission. He thought he would be doing the master and his cause a great benefit by having it demonstrated to these Jews that the master could not be silenced or harmed by any act of theirs. It was really an act that grew out of his love for and belief in the greatness of the master's powers. So the picture that John paints for us is of Judas Iscariot, meaning of Cariot, as a disciple who is so convinced of Jesus' powers and abilities that he sets up a confrontation with the powers that be, in which he was absolutely convinced Jesus would prevail. Now, at the time when this happened, Jesus had been playing a kind of cat and mouse game with the Jewish authorities, deliberately avoiding confrontation. And at some point, Judas simply became impatient with this and decided to force Jesus' hand. In a more recent message, it's made clear that there was something Jesus did, a deliberate demonstration of humility that triggered Judas, which interestingly is mentioned in the New Testament, although its effect on Judas is not spelt out in the received text. Anyway, Judas is not the first enthusiastic follower to want to see more decisive action from a teacher or leader he believed in, but whose approach he did not fully understand. What John tells us here obviously conflicts with much of the traditional story that surrounds the events of the Last Supper and their meaning. James Padgett quickly picks up on this because at this point he clearly asks John about the traditional teaching that Jesus anticipated his own death. John replies, well, I tell you that Jesus never said any such thing. He never even told us that one of us should betray him. And I know because I was there. If Jesus knew that Judas would betray him, he did not tell any of us at that time, and we only knew it for the first time when Judas actually committed the act. Mark 14:10. I don't believe that Jesus knew it before that time. In fact, he has told me that he was surprised at Judas's betrayal of him. That could not be clearer. John continues, Judas was the youngest of the disciples and not so easily controlled in his impulses and acts as he would have been were he older. So you must not rely on the Bible statement Mark 14:41, as to what occurred at that time. The text at Mark 14:41 is one that clearly describes Jesus as saying he was betrayed and that events were about to occur. James Padgett rightly responds that this text isn't the only one that shows Jesus anticipating his betrayal and death. John replies, "I know, but they are all based upon the same erroneous writings. For you must know that these Gospels, as you have them, are not the originals written by those whose names they bear. Let not these things disturb your belief in the essential truths which the Bible contains." That's a tricky statement. If the Gospels as we have them are not the originals as written, but we are nevertheless to trust in the essential truths of the Bible, how do we pick out those essential truths? John continues, the trouble is that Jesus, as the individual, is given the prominence which should be given to his teachings. He is displeased very much because of this, and one of the great objects of his writing anew his truths is to correct that error and make the truths which he received from the Father the prominent things. As you progress in your writings, you will see that this is the great object of which he shall write. Essentially, John goes back to what he said earlier. There are truths in the Bible that are to be relied upon, but in order to determine what those are, James Padgett is advised to rely upon the messages he will receive, and he is told that this is why they are important. The intention is to clarify what those teachings are and to prioritize them by refocusing on the message rather than the messenger. This in turn means that Padgett should put greater effort into praying for divine love in order to assist with the process of conveying the messages that Jesus and others wish to write through him. On this, John says to Padgett, "I will tell you that you are in the way to receive God's love in very great abundance. In fact, so much so that you will realize that you are at one with him. I see that at present you have some difficulty in your way, but it will soon disappear and leave you free to do this great work. So my advice is to believe in the Master and pray to God, and you will soon be a much happier man." That mention of the happiness that comes with divine love is something that James Padgett is told time and again. And those in spirit who tell James of their experience of sharing in divine love often mention their own state of happiness, describing it as a consequence of that sharing. Indeed, this state of happiness is often given and emphasized so as to encourage the rest of us to begin this process. In a previous message, we saw Jesus say that John was the disciple who best understood Jesus' teaching of divine love, and that he, after Jesus himself, was the one who had most of the divine love in his soul. John goes on to share with James Padgett a little about his life on earth and of life in spirit, again correcting traditional teachings about other New Testament figures. "When on earth I was a married man, and in my family the mother of Jesus lived until her death." John 19:27. "Mary lives near me and is a beautiful spirit and filled with the love of God." John puts that second sentence in the present tense. So he is clearly saying that now, in spirit, he and Mary live near each other. But he adds this caution. "However, you must not suppose that because she was the mother of Jesus, she has any more exalted position in the spirit world than she otherwise would have had. Family ties do not determine anything in the higher spheres. The soul development is the criterion. Many spirits are living in higher spheres than Mary. I will not write more now. Your brother in Christ, John. So we finish John's message with a reminder that soul development is the only thing that will fit any soul to a life in the higher spheres and planes of spirit, whether in the seven spiritual heavens or the higher or celestial ones that transcend them. This applies to anyone, no matter how famous they were during their earthly life, and no matter who they were related to. Given that much of John's message was about Judas of Iscariot, it seems appropriate to hear from Judas himself. The message I want to look at is very short, but it was given just 8 days after that message from John. So he realized he was being spoken about and took the opportunity to make his own contribution. This message was given on August 23, 1915. I am here, Judas. I came tonight because I want to tell you just what my condition and expectations were when I betrayed Jesus, which resulted in his crucifixion. I was a very enthusiastic lover of the Master and believed thoroughly in his teachings and his power, and did not believe that the Roman soldiers could take him away from where we were if we did not permit it to be done. As a consequence, I was anxious that Jesus should show his great power and demonstrate to the Jews that he was the true Son of God, with power over men and devils. I never betrayed him for the money that I received. Matthew 26:15. For it was not sufficient to pay for one moment of happiness which I have lost because of my act of betraying the greatest spirit in all God's kingdom. I see that you are too sleepy to write more tonight. I will come again and tell my story. So good night, Judas. So we see again that the motivation on Judas' part was to set up a confrontation with the Jewish leaders who were fearful of Jesus' teachings, in the hope that this would result in an obvious, visible victory for Jesus that no one would be able to ignore, which would then oblige everyone to pay attention to what he taught. Although not malicious, it is still the case that what Judas did was a serious mistake because it led to Jesus' trial and execution. So the outcome was definitely unwelcome. Indeed, Judas himself still refers to his action as a betrayal. Far from being part of a preordained plan, this resulted in Jesus being removed from this earth far sooner than should have happened. Also, even though Judas' actions may have been well-intentioned as he saw things, it's still worth pointing out that an attempt to force events through physical action is entirely at odds with the spiritual teachings that Jesus gave and gives. And that's a lesson that many people still don't learn easily. If you're interested in learning more about Judas, there are plenty more messages about and from him, and we'll get to some of them as we work through the Padgett messages. The other thing I should mention is that as well as James Padgett, there have been a small number of other mediums who have been used as instruments for the writing of similar messages that take forward the work that James Padgett did. These are mediums who began with the teaching of divine love and started that process of development, putting into practice the teachings contained in the Padgett writings. About 20 years ago, one of those mediums brought through a large number of fascinating messages from Judas, which have been compiled and published. I've put a link in the video description as to where you can obtain those. Also, just to remind that there is always a written transcript for these videos, in case you prefer to read as well as listen, or instead of listening. I always publish those on my Medium account, medium.com/@Anton1. That link is on the channel homepage. The link for each individual video transcript is always given in each video description box down below. The next video in this sequence, video 10.12, which will be uploaded next Sunday, will look at a message from the Apostle Luke, who also has a few things to say about the version of his gospel that made it into the New Testament. In future messages, we will look at some more of the reasons the texts in the New Testament are so heavily altered as compared with what the apostles originally wrote. The next midweek video, 2.12, will look at another message from Joseph Salyard's, James Padgett's old law professor, where he comments on how much he is learning from some of the other people in spirit who write to James. So I hope I'll see you for one or both of those videos. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this one, do please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It all helps to spread knowledge of this material, and it's good to join in the sharing. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.